They came when the Horde still had a use for her. That was how Raketes would later explain it to the orphan, the girl who smelled of ash and refused to cry, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor of the keep at the edge of the Gallo wastes, her tusks still small, her armor still dented from the ambush that had taken 3 of her warband. She would say, "They came because they needed a womb and a name, not because they valued what I was." And the orphan, who understood the difference between being needed and being wanted better than most creatures twice her age, would nod slowly and say nothing at all. But that was later. First there was the Horde. The Vargathos Horde was the oldest military alliance on the continent of Shale, and it had not survived 1,200 years by being sentimental. It had survived by doing what was necessary. It had consumed smaller clans the way a river consumes tributaries, not violently, exactly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. It had broken the spine of the Farron Confederation at the Battle of the Ashen Crossing. It had made the Sulhari Empire sign the Compact of Chains with nothing but a siege and a patience that outlasted 3 generations of Sulhari emperors. It had done these things and many more, and it had endured, and its warlords had grown comfortable in the knowledge that endurance was its own form of wisdom. Raketes was not comfortable with that knowledge. She was 22 years old and she had earned her first scar at 14, and she understood, with a clarity that sometimes felt more like a wound than a gift, that endurance without purpose was just a slow death with better posture. She was also, technically, the 4th daughter of Clan Ketes, which meant she had no standing to question anything at all. She questioned it anyway. The meeting of the Warchief's Council was held in the Great Hall at Varmora, which was lit by the burning fat of rendered animals and smelled exactly like what it was, a room full of old killers deciding the shape of the world. Raketes stood in the second ring of petitioners, a position that meant she could see everything and speak only if spoken to, and she watched the Warchief lay out his terms for the expansion pact with the Drekval Syndicate. She had read the terms the night before. She had read them twice and then a third time because she was the kind of person who read things 3 times when they troubled her, and the terms had troubled her deeply. The Syndicate wanted territories in the Wallow Plains, Orc territories, clan territories that had been held since before the Horde's founding, in exchange for manufacturing rights and weapons supply. The Syndicate would provide iron, the Horde would provide land, and the clans who lived on that land would be relocated. Relocated. The word sat in the document like something that had crawled in from outside. Warchief. She spoke before she meant to. It happened sometimes, the words getting out ahead of the thinking, which was one of the reasons her elder sisters called her reckless, and one of the reasons she privately agreed with them. The Wallow clans have held treaty rights since the Second Compact. The Vargathos founding document guarantees there. The founding document, said the Warchief, who was a very large orc named Dorvith and who had not reached his position by tolerating interruptions, is not the subject of this council. With respect, Warchief, if we surrender the founding document's core provisions in exchange for iron supply. With respect, said Dorvith, and his tone made the phrase mean something else entirely, you are the 4th daughter of a minor clan. You have no standing in this council. You are here as a courtesy. She had known he would say that. She had known it and she had spoken anyway, and now the silence in the hall was the kind that had weight to it, the kind you could feel pressing against your ribs. I am here as a warrior of the Horde, she said, which the founding document grants standing to any warrior who has drawn blood in the Horde's name. I have the scar to prove the first condition. She touched the line across her jaw, old and white. The second condition I am attempting to fulfill now. The silence got heavier. Dorvith looked at her for a long time. He had eyes the color of old iron, and they had seen a great many things, and what they communicated now was not anger exactly, but something colder and more considered. The council will recess, he said, while we address a matter of procedure." The matter of procedure took 11 minutes. When the council reconvened, Raketes had been informed that her participation in the Horde's formal campaigns would be suspended pending a review of her clan's treaty obligations, which meant, in the language the Horde used for things it didn't want to say plainly, that she was out. She cleaned out her billet that evening. It didn't take long. She had never accumulated much. Her warband found her at the edge of camp, Gret, who was her second and had the disposition of a patient stone wall, and Sova, who was the best tracker she'd ever met and who expressed emotion exclusively through the angle of her ears, and old Porig, who had been with her since the beginning and who said nothing, but handed her a flask of something that burned pleasantly going down. "Orders," Gret said. "I've been removed from the campaign roster." "I know, orders." She looked at them. She looked at the camp behind them, the fires of the Horde stretching out across the dark like something that had always been there and always would be. She thought about the founding document, which she had memorized at age 9 because her mother had told her that a warrior who didn't understand the laws she fought under was just a weapon with legs. "We move," she said, "east." Gret nodded. Sova's ears angled forward, anticipation, maybe, or something adjacent to it. Porig took the flask back and stoppered it and put it in his pack with the care of someone preserving something valuable. They moved east. The eastern territories were not, technically, abandoned. They were instead the kind of place that the Horde had expanded past, and not yet circled back to. A broad plateau of scrub and granite and old ruins, from the civilization that had preceded the Orc expansion, whatever that civilization had been. The ruins were interesting in the way that things are interesting when you have nothing else to look at. Crumbling columns with carvings worn too smooth to read, foundations of buildings whose original purposes could only be guessed at, the occasional intact room open to the sky like a confession. Raketes set up a camp in the ruins of something that might have been a gatehouse, and spent 3 days being quietly furious about the expansion pact, and reading the text she'd brought, a copy of the founding document, a history of the Second Compact, a slim volume of tactical philosophy that an old teacher had pressed into her hands 7 years ago with the instruction not to read it until she'd won a real battle and lost a real argument. She had now done both. On the 4th day, Sova came back from a scouting run with her ears at an angle Raketes had never seen before. Not fear, not excitement, something in between that didn't have a word. "You need to come," Sova said. It was a human child. The child was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, which Raketes understood was young for a human, but could not calibrate further because her experience with human children was limited to having once seen some at a distance during a Horde campaign and being told not to interact with them. The child was sitting in the ruins of what might have been a market square, surrounded by the evidence of a fire that had happened recently, scorched ground. The smell of burned wood still sharp in the cold air, and there was ash on the child's face and hands and clothing, and the child was not crying. This was notable. Raketes had encountered humans in distress before. They typically cried. This one was sitting very still with her arms around her knees, looking at the burned ruins around her, with an expression that was not grief exactly, but something more than grief. Something that had passed through grief and come out the other side into a territory without a name. Raketes crouched down, which put her closer to the child's eye level, and also, she suspected, made her look less immediately threatening. "What happened?" she said. The child looked at her. The child's eyes were a dark brown and were, Raketes noticed, entirely dry. "Soldiers," the child said. "Whose soldiers?" A pause. The child seemed to be considering the question in a way that went beyond the literal meaning, turning it over, examining it for weight. "The kind that don't say whose they are," the child finally said. Raketes thought about the expansion pact. She thought about the Drekval Syndicate and the Wallow Plains and the word relocated. She thought about soldiers who had no insignia because insignia implied accountability. "Are you alone?" she said. "Now I am. Is there somewhere I can take you? Family, village, anything?" The child looked at her again, and it was a look that Raketes would think about later, and later again, and eventually come to understand as the specific look of someone who has already run the calculation and arrived at an answer they don't want but won't argue with. "No," the child said. The name the child gave was Marin. Just Marin, no clan name, no family name, offered with the flat simplicity of someone who had already decided that names beyond the first were a kind of ownership she had no use for anymore. Raketes brought her back to camp and Porig gave her food without comment, and Sova kept a careful, unobtrusive watch, and Gret looked at Raketes with an expression that said, wordlessly and clearly, that this was complicated. "I know," Raketes said. "The Horde doesn't." "I know. A human child in an Orc camp in the Eastern Territories, after you've already been removed from the campaign roster." "Gret, I'm just noting the various ways this could go badly." "Noted." She looked at Marin, who was eating methodically and without apparent pleasure, the way you eat when you're feeding a body you're not sure you believe in anymore. The ash was still on her hands, and she hadn't wiped it off, and Raketes wondered if that was grief or stubbornness, or just the fact that there wasn't water nearby and the child hadn't asked. "We need water," Raketes said to Gret. "The western cistern, the one we mapped 2 days ago, take Sova." Gret understood instructions given in a particular tone. He and Sova left. Porig, who had the gift of being present without impinging, found something to occupy himself on the other side of the camp. Raketes sat down across from Marin. "You're not going to ask me to leave," Marin said. "It wasn't a question." "No." "Why not?" Raketes thought about how to answer that. She thought about the founding document and the expansion pact and the word relocated. She thought about the way Marin was eating, feeding an engine she wasn't certain she wanted to keep running. And she thought about 14-year-old Raketes earning her first scar in a skirmish no one should have started, fighting for a horde that would later call her a courtesy. "Because I was asked to leave once," she said, "and it was the wrong call." Marin looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to eating. They stayed in the eastern ruins through the turn of the month. It was not, by any standard that the horde would have recognized, a military encampment. It was 4 orcs and a human child, and a collection of tents in the foundations of something that had once mattered. Raketes spent her mornings working through the tactical philosophy text, which turned out to be less about tactics than about the difference between force and leverage. The idea that a small pressure applied at the right point could move things that a large force applied wrongly never could. Marin, it turned out, was literate, more than literate. She had come from a settlement that had maintained a small school, the kind of thing that persisted in human communities, with a stubbornness that Raketes found both inexplicable and admirable. And she had read everything the school possessed, which was not a lot but which she had clearly consumed completely and was still digesting. She was curious about everything, not the shallow curiosity of novelty-seeking, but a deep, systematic curiosity that wanted to understand how things worked, why they worked, what would happen if they worked differently. She asked questions about Orc social structure and then cross-referenced the answers against questions about the ruins around them. She picked up fragments of inscription from the worn columns and spent hours trying to match them against linguistic patterns she had apparently memorized from a history book. "The language is older than the compact," she said one afternoon, showing Raketes a fragment she'd been working on. "See this root appears in pre-compact Solhari, but the suffix structure is different. It's like they were related but one derived from the other." Raketes looked at the fragment. She looked at the girl who was holding it. "How do you know pre-compact Solhari?" she said. Marin shrugged. "There was a book. In your settlement school. It was a very unusual book. Raketes thought about that. She thought about a human settlement in territory that was not technically Horde land, but which the Horde's expansion pact was going to make Syndicate land. And she thought about a school in that settlement, and a girl who had read everything in it, including a very unusual book about pre-compact Sulhari linguistics. And then she thought about soldiers with no insignia and ash. She put the tactical philosophy text down. "Tell me about your settlement," she said, "all of it." What Marin told her over the next 3 hours was not, in itself, surprising. It was a version of a story Raketes had been told in different forms since she was old enough to understand the expansion pact documents, which was to say since she was 9. A community. Resources the Syndicate wanted. Residents the Syndicate didn't want, or rather, didn't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require paying them for what was being taken. Soldiers with no insignia. Fire. What was surprising, what shifted something in Raketes' chest in a way she would not have words for until much later, was the way Marin told it. Without tears and without performance, but also without the flat affect of someone who has shut down. More like a witness giving testimony. More like someone who has decided that the act of accurate description is itself a form of resistance, that truth precisely told is something that cannot be burned. "Your school," Raketes said when Marin had finished. "The books." "Gone," Marin said. "All of it." "Not all of it," she touched her own temple lightly, "not what's in here." Marin looked at her for a moment with those dry, dark eyes. Then she said, "My teacher used to say that they couldn't burn what you'd already read." "Your teacher was right." "My teacher is dead." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of accurate description, of testimony precisely given, of things that had happened and could not be unhappened but could be remembered, could be insisted upon, could be refused the comfort of being forgotten. Gret appeared at the edge of the camp with water and the expression of someone who had been listening from a discreet distance for some time and had arrived at a decision. "We need more people," he said. It turned out that the eastern territories were not as empty as they looked. This was something Raketes had suspected but not confirmed, on the logic that the Horde tended to assume emptiness in territories it hadn't formally claimed, and the Horde's assumptions had a way of becoming policy. The ruins spread for 3 days' walk in every direction, and in the ruins, if you knew how to look, if you were Sova, whose tracking skills were the kind that made the ground tell you its secrets, you could find signs of habitation. Old fire pits, carefully scattered. Cache sites in the old foundations. A series of markers that looked like natural rockfall until you realized the angles were wrong. Sova found the first group on a Tuesday, which was not a day the Orcs observed, but which Marin had been quietly maintaining in a small notebook she'd produced from somewhere in her clothing, apparently as a matter of personal discipline. 3 humans, 2 adult and 1 adolescent, living in what had been a cistern room beneath a collapsed colonnade. They had food for 2 weeks and weapons for a determined stand, and the look of people who had long ago decided that a determined stand was the most they could hope for. The adults were named Corvus and Jesper. The adolescent, who was 14 and apparently felt this entitled him to an opinion on everything, was called Dane. "An orc," Corvus said, looking at Raketes with the studied neutrality of someone managing a strong first reaction. "Several orcs," Raketes said, "and we're not here to relocate you." The word relocated landed in the space between them like something thrown. Corvus's neutrality slipped for just a moment, not grief, exactly, more like recognition, and then came back. "No," Corvus said, "I imagine you're not." Over the following 2 weeks, Sova found 6 more groups. Not all of them were human. There was a pair of Farron, short, heavily built, with the perpetually suspicious eyes of a people who had been conquered twice. who had apparently been living in the ruins for 3 months and who communicated primarily through a series of gestures that Marin decoded faster than any of the orcs, because she had naturally read something about it. There was an old Sulhari woman named Voss who traveled alone and claimed to be a healer, which turned out to be accurate, and who looked at Raketes the first time they met with an expression of such frank assessment that it felt like being examined from the inside. "You were Horde," Voss said. "I was. What are you now?" Raketes thought about it. It was not a question she had answered before in words, though she had been living the answer since the day she'd packed her billet. "Something that hasn't been named yet," she said. Voss nodded, as if that was exactly the right answer, and agreed to stay. The camp expanded. Not quickly, nothing in the ruins expanded quickly, because quick expansion left marks that insignia-less soldiers could follow, but steadily, each new group joining the way tributaries join a river, adding their particular quality to the current. Corvus turned out to have been an engineer before the Syndicate's expansion had reclassified his community as an obstacle, and he began making structural assessments of the ruins with an eye toward what could be shored up and what should be avoided. Jesper was a teacher, Marin had identified immediately, which Jesper had not said but which was visible in the way she spoke to the younger members of the group, patient and specific, and unwilling to oversimplify. Dane had opinions about everything and was occasionally right. The Farron pair, who gave their names as Thick and Sost, turned out to be architects of the cash system Sova had found, and when Raketes offered them a more formal role in distributing supplies, they accepted with a gravity that suggested they had been waiting for someone to ask. It was Marin who first said the word that nobody had said yet. She said it quietly, on an evening when Raketes was going through supply counts, and the light was going orange and long across the ruins, and the sound of the camp, the mix of languages and the smell of cooking fires, and the particular quality of a community that is building something without having agreed to call it that yet, was doing something to the air that Raketes could not precisely name. "This is a school," Marin said. Raketes looked up from the supply count. "The way you're doing it," Marin said. "Corvus knows engineering, Jesper knows history, Voss knows medicine, Thick and Sost know logistics, you know tactics, and everyone knows something else on top of that, and you keep asking them to teach each other." She paused. "That's a school." Raketes looked at her, looked at the camp, looked at Gret, who was listening from nearby with the expression of someone who had thought the same thing and was interested to see whether Raketes would say it. "A school needs to teach something," Raketes said. "What is it teaching?" Marin looked at her with those dry, precise dark eyes. "How to not be erased," she said. There was a moment, sometime in the 3rd month, when Raketes almost lost Marin. Not to the Syndicate soldiers, not to the cold or the ruins or the hardship of a camp that was still, in those months, more possibility than reality. She almost lost her to the specific gravity of grief, which does not always announce itself but sometimes waits until a quiet evening and a half-completed inscription, and a child who has been holding herself together for so long that the holding has become the thing she understands as herself. And then the question arises of who she is when she isn't holding. It happened on a night when the wind was wrong, coming from the west with the smell of char on it, controlled burning, Sova assessed, land clearance, someone making space for construction. And Marin had been at the inscription work for 3 hours and had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual focused quiet, heavier, settled closer to the ground. Raketes found her on the far side of the old colonnade, sitting with her back against a column and her hands flat on the cold stone floor. Not crying. Still not crying, which had stopped being notable and had started being something that worried Raketes in the way that symptoms worry a healer. Not because the symptom is the problem, but because the absence of the symptom sometimes means the problem has gone somewhere you can't see. She sat down next to her, Not across from her this time, next to her, back against the same column, close enough that their shoulders were a few inches apart in the cold. She didn't say anything for a while. "I keep trying to remember her face," Marin said finally. "My teacher's face. And I can remember her voice, and I can remember the way she moved, and I can remember specific things she said on specific days, but I can't get the face to hold still." "That happens," Raketti said, "with the ones we've lost. It feels like losing her again." "Yes." Marin was quiet. The wind came through the colonnade with its wrong smell, and the fire on the far side shifted and threw long shadows across the worn columns. "She used to say that the worst thing the powerful did wasn't burning the books," Marin said. "The worst thing was making you forget that the books existed, because then you stop asking for them. You stop knowing there's something missing." "She was right," Raketti said. "I don't want to forget she said that." "Write it down." Marin looked at her. "I don't have paper." Raketti's reached into her pack. She had one blank page left in the tactical philosophy text's end papers, the kind of page that was meant for notes, slightly rougher than the rest. She tore it out carefully. "Write it down," she said again. "Tonight, before the face starts to blur, write the words she said. You can't hold everything in your head forever. That's what paper is for." Marin took the page. She took the small writing tool she kept in her clothing. It was always there, Raketti's had noticed, the way warriors keep a secondary blade, and she sat for a moment with the blank page in her hands. "What if I get it wrong?" she said. "What if I remember it wrong?" "Then write what you remember," Raketti said. "Write that you might have gotten it wrong. Future people who read it will understand that memory is imperfect. They'll understand that you wrote it anyway, which is more important than getting it right." Marin looked at her for a moment with the dark eyes that saw things precisely. "Is that from the tactical philosophy text?" "No," Raketti said. "I made it up just now, but it's true." Marin wrote. She wrote for a long time, and Raketti sat with her in the cold with the wrong-smelling wind and didn't leave, because leaving was the thing that should not be done, and Raketti's had enough experience with being left to understand the weight of staying. When Marin finished, she folded the paper very carefully and put it inside her clothing, close to the small writing tool, which told Raketti something about where the child kept the things that mattered. "Thank you," Marin said. "You did the work. You stayed." Raketti's looked at the worn columns, the shadows, the long darkness of the Eastern Territory stretching away beyond the colonnade's broken walls. "I was asked to leave once," she said. "I already told you that. What I didn't tell you is what the leaving felt like. It felt like being erased. Like the war chief had decided that my inconvenient question made me into an obstacle, and obstacles get reclassified." She paused. "I know what you're carrying. I don't know the exact weight because it's yours, but I know the shape." Marin was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My teacher's name was Sorrel. She had gray eyes and she moved fast when she was interested in something, like the rest of her was trying to keep up with her mind." "Good," Raketti said. "And she laughed at her own bad jokes before they were finished, so you could always tell when one was coming. Write that down too." Marin pulled the paper back out, unfolded it, and wrote. They stayed in the colonnade until the fire on the far side guttered, and Porig, with his reliable quality of quiet maintenance, came and rebuilt it without comment, and the wrong-smelling wind turned and went elsewhere, and the night settled back into the ordinary cold. The news arrived with a pair of scouts from the Wallow Plains, 2 young Orcs, barely older than Marin, who had come east following the route that Sova had marked 2 weeks earlier after Raketti's had quietly sent word that there was a place in the ruins for anyone who needed one. The scouts' names were Tech and Brish, and they came with news and with the particular quality of exhaustion that is not physical but moral, the kind that comes from watching something you believed in become something you no longer recognize. The expansion pact had been ratified. The Wallow Plain clans were being moved. The Syndicate's construction crews had arrived in the territories, and they were not, the scouts reported, subtle about it. They moved with a systematic thoroughness that suggested long practice clearing space without ceremony, classifying everything they encountered as either resource or obstacle, using whatever tools were required to convert the second category into something manageable. The clan elders had protested. The war chief had told them that protest was not a mechanism recognized by the pact. "What about the founding document?" Raketti said. Tech looked at her. He was 18, and he had the face of someone who had believed in something until very recently. "The war chief says the founding document applies to relations between clans, not to the Horde's commercial agreements." Raketti sat with that for a moment. "He's wrong," she said. "The second clause is explicit." "He's the war chief." "The war chief can be wrong. It's not a condition that only applies to fourth daughters." Tech blinked. Something shifted in his expression, not quite hope, but the antechamber of hope, the place you stand before you commit to it. "What are you going to do?" he said. Raketti's looked at the camp around her, at the people who had found her, or found each other, in the ruins of something that had once been a civilization, at the fire and the supply caches and Corvuses engineering notes and Jesper teaching 3 children at once, and Voss examining a Farron who had arrived that morning with a joint problem, and Marin sitting with an inscription fragment, and a focused expression that was by now familiar enough to feel like home. She thought about leverage, about the difference between force and leverage, about a small pressure applied at the right point. "First," she said, "we teach." The teaching was the work of the next 6 months, and it was harder than fighting and more important. And Raketti's was honest with herself, and with anyone who asked, that she had not fully understood that until she was in the middle of it. The thing about teaching, about the specific kind of teaching they were doing, which was not the transmission of facts but the practice of thinking, was that it changed the people doing it as much as the people receiving it. Corvus, explaining engineering principles, found that he had to articulate things he'd always known intuitively, and the articulation clarified them. Jesper, teaching history, found that the questions the mixed group asked, questions shaped by Orc perspectives and Farron perspectives and Solhari perspectives, showed her the edges of her own assumptions. Voss's medicine, shared with everyone who wanted to learn it, became a common language for a community that had several other languages, and not always a shared one. Marin was in every lesson. She moved between them the way water moves, finding the lowest point, filling the available space, never forceful but impossible to keep out. She had an aptitude for synthesis, for taking 2 apparently unrelated things and finding the angle at which they connected, that Raketti's recognized as rare, and that several of the others clearly found slightly unnerving. "She's 8, Dane said once, watching Marin explain to the 2 Farron how a Solhari accounting system could be adapted for their supply caches. "9, Raketti said. "She's 9 and she's doing whatever that is." "Education," Raketti said, "applied without condescension." Dane thought about that. He was 14 and had opinions about everything, but he was also honest enough to update them. "I want to do that," he said. "Then do it." He started the next day, working with the younger children who'd arrived with later groups, awkward at first in the specific way of someone who knows they know things but hasn't yet learned to know how they know them. But the awkwardness was temporary. The patience wasn't. He had more of it than he'd appeared to, which turned out to be a pattern with almost everyone in the ruins, that they contained capacities that the circumstances of their previous lives had not found occasion to demand. Raketti's watched it unfold and kept the perimeter secure and thought about leverage. She had during those 6 months been doing something else alongside the teaching. She had been reading, not just the tactical philosophy text which she'd finished and started again, but everything she could find: Corvus's engineering notes, Jesper's historical analysis, Voss's medical records, Thick and Sost's logistics system. She had been reading and thinking, and following a thread that had started in the founding document and ran through the Second Compact, and the Expansion Pact, and the Warchief's reinterpretation of the Second Clause. And the thread ended in a place that was legally complicated, but also, she thought, structurally sound. The Horde's founding document, she said to Gret one night, doesn't just guarantee standing to warriors who have drawn blood in the Horde's name. It also establishes the Warchief's authority as conditional, not absolute. Gret looked at her with the expression of someone who knows where this is going and has been waiting for it to arrive. The condition, Rackety said, is the maintenance of the compact obligations. The founding document says, explicitly, that the Warchief holds authority and trust for the Horde as a whole, and that authority forfeited through violation of the founding compact reverts, not to the Council, not to the clan elders, to the Horde's warriors directly. The Warchief will say he hasn't violated the compact. The Warchief will say that. The text says something different. She put down the document she'd been reading from and looked at Gret directly. I need you to take a message to the Wallow Plain clans, and then to every warrior encampment on the Eastern Front who's been given a courtesy posting. Gret was quiet for a moment. You're going to challenge the Warchief. I'm going to invoke the compact. That's different. Is it? Racketys thought about Marin. About testimony precisely given. About refusing the comfort of being forgotten. It has to be, she said. The response came faster than she expected, which told her something about how many people had been waiting for someone to use the right word. The Wallow clan elders sent 3 representatives, traveling quietly and by night, arriving at the ruins with the careful relief of people who have been holding their breath for a long time. They were named Gordath, Vessel, and a very old orc named Urin, who had been alive for the founding of the Second Compact, and who carried the weight of that history in the specific way of someone who had watched things be built and watched them erode, and had not yet decided which was more instructive. The warriors came in 1s and 2s, enough of them over 3 weeks to make the camp something larger than it had been. Not an army, not yet, maybe not ever exactly, but a community that had teeth, which was different. What surprised Racketys, though she later decided it shouldn't have, was who else came. A delegation from the Drekval Syndicate's own workforce arrived on a cold morning in the 6th month. 6 humans in syndicate work clothes with the specific look of people who have been deciding something for a long time and have finally decided it. Their leader was a man named Wrath who had the kind of face that showed everything and tried to hide nothing, which Racketys found immediately trustworthy. We build what they tell us to build, Wrath said. We've been building it for 3 years. We're done building it. What changed? Racketys said. 3 months ago they told us to build on the Wallow Plains. He looked at her steadily. We built on the Wallow Plains. We saw what was there before. The silence was the kind that contained a great deal of accurate testimony that nobody was going to make anyone say out loud. You're welcome here, Racketys said, on the same terms as everyone else. What terms are those? She thought about how to say it. She thought about Marin and the inscription fragments and the things you carry in your head that no one can burn. You teach what you know, she said. You learn what you don't. You don't erase anyone. Wrath looked around the ruins at the mixed community, the fires, the sound of multiple languages in the evening air. At Marin, who was currently teaching 3 orcs and a Farron how to read Sulhari technical notation, with the focused patience of someone for whom this was simply the obvious next thing to do. Done, he said. The Warchief sent a response to Racketys' compact invocation on the 40th day after she'd sent it, which was faster than the law required and slower than anger would have moved, which told her he'd taken it seriously and consulted someone before responding. The response was, in essence, no. The second clause of the founding document, Dorvith argued through his legal representative, applied only to violations of the interclan compact obligations, not to commercial agreements made under the Horde's sovereign authority. The expansion pact was not a compact violation, but an exercise of that authority. The invocation was without legal standing. Racketti's removal from the campaign roster was confirmed. The Eastern Territories were being incorporated into the syndicate's operational zone. It was, she admitted to herself, a solid argument. The kind of argument that a good legal mind had put a lot of work into and that would hold up in any forum the warchief controlled. The founding document, however, had not been written in a forum the warchief controlled. "He's correct," Urin said, when Rackettis showed the response to the old orc. Urin had been examining documents for 3 days, moving slowly but with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this for decades and was finally having the conversation. About the second clause, he's interpreting it correctly. Rackettis waited. "He's wrong about the 7th clause," Urin said, "which he didn't cite, because if he'd cited it, he'd have to address it." She leaned forward. "What does the 7th clause say?" "The 7th clause," Urin said, with the careful diction of someone who had been waiting a long time to say this, "establishes that all territorial arrangements affecting clan holdings require ratification by a council of the affected clan's elders. Not by the warchief's council, by the elders directly." He looked at her. "The Wallow Plain clan's elders were not consulted before the expansion pact was ratified. They were informed after." "Which means the pact is unratified," Urin said, "in the specific technical sense that the document requires, which means it isn't law." He paused. "Which means the construction on the Wallow Plains isn't authorized. Which means the soldiers who burned the settlement that the child came from were operating without legal sanction." "The settlement that the child came from." Rackettis looked at him for a long time. "Can you prove it?" "I don't need to prove it," Urin said. "It's written in the founding document." The warchief just didn't cite the 7th clause because he was hoping no one would look. She thought about leverage, about a small pressure applied at the right point. "I need every elder from the Wallow Plain clans to sign a document," she said, stating that they were not consulted before the pact was ratified, as a matter of historical record. "That will take 2 weeks." "I know. And the warchief will know what you're doing once the first elder signs." "I know that too." Urin looked at her with eyes that had seen a great many things and had learned to distinguish between the ones that mattered and the ones that didn't. "The 4th daughter of Clan Keddies," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite amusement. "Just a warrior," Rackettis said, "with a scar and an argument." The 2 weeks were the tense kind. The warchief dispatched formal emissaries to the Eastern Territories, not soldiers, which would have been a different thing entirely, and which Rackettis suspected he was too legally cautious to risk, but representatives with official insignia and the practiced authority of people who move through the world certain that authority would be recognized. Rackettis received them in what had become, over 6 months, the main hall of the ruins, the old colonnade, now partially roofed by Corvus's engineering, with walls hung with maps and documents and inscriptions that Marin had decoded, and Jesper had contextualized, and Thick and Sost had organized into a filing system of fearsome efficiency. It was, she noted with private satisfaction, a striking room in which to have a legal argument. The lead emissary was a large orc named Drast, who had the bearing of someone who had conducted many of these conversations and found them simple. He looked around the colonnade with an expression of controlled assessment. "Warchief Dorvith requests your return to the Horde's formation," Drast said. "The Eastern Territories are being formally incorporated under the Expansion Pact, and your presence here complicates the administrative process." "I'm sure it does," Rackettis said. "Remind the warchief of the 7th clause." Drast's assessment expression shifted slightly. The war chief has addressed the invocation in his formal response. The war chief's response addressed the second clause, Rackety said, not the seventh. The seventh clause establishes elder ratification as a prerequisite for territorial arrangements. The Wallow Plain elders have not ratified the expansion pact. She gestured to Urin, who was sitting to her right with the collected documents. Drast looked at the documents, looked at Urin, who was very old and very clearly present in the specific way of someone who had been waiting for this moment for some time. This has not been adjudicated, Drast said. Which is why I am requesting adjudication, Rackety said, before a council of the affected elders as specified in the founding document, not the war chief's council. The elders' council, which the seventh clause establishes as the appropriate forum. There is no established elders' council. There is now, Rackety said. We convened one yesterday. Drast looked at her for a long time. He was, she suspected, recalculating. He had come expecting a simple conversation and was encountering something more like a complete legal argument, assembled quietly over months, sitting in a ruined colonnade in the Eastern Territories, staffed by a former history teacher and a 9-year-old and a very old orc who remembered the founding. I'll carry your message, he said finally. Thank you, she said. Also tell him that the syndicate workers who have come east are willing to give testimony about what they built and where. In writing if required. Drast left. Gret, who had been standing to her left throughout, let out a slow breath. That went well, he said. He's going to tell the war chief everything, and the war chief is going to have to decide whether he wants a legal proceeding or a military confrontation, Rackety said. Either way, we've made the choice his. He has to move. And if he chooses military confrontation. She looked around the colonnade. At the mixed community that had built itself out of the people the Horde's expansion had displaced, and the people the Syndicate's expansion had made redundant, and the people who had simply, one by one, decided that there was something worth building in the ruins of what had been erased. Then we explained to every warrior on the Eastern Front, she said, that the war chief is preparing to use illegal force against a legally convened elders' council, and we let the founding document do the rest. The war chief chose the legal proceeding. He chose it, Rackety suspected, because his legal representative had told him he would lose the military one, not the fighting, which he would likely win, but the political aftermath, which would be permanent, and because the legal proceeding offered at least the possibility of finding a reading of the seventh clause that he could work with. He did not find one. The Elders' Council convened in the colonnade on a clear day in late spring, 43 days after Racketes had sent the invocation, with representatives from 11 clans and Urin serving as the council's senior voice. Drast attended as the war chief's representative. Gordath, Vessel, and the 2 other Wallow Plain elders attended as the directly affected parties. Wrath and 2 of the syndicate workers attended as witnesses. Marin attended because she was present in the ruins and had prepared, without being asked, a complete annotated copy of the relevant sections of the founding document with Sulhari technical notation, translated into plain language. Dane attended and sat very still in the back row, in a way that suggested he had opinions he was successfully not expressing, which Racketes found privately excellent. The proceeding took 6 hours. Urin presented the 7th clause argument with the precision of someone who had been sharpening it for decades. Drast presented the war chief's counterargument, which was well constructed and cited 4 secondary documents and still could not get around the plain language of the 7th clause, which Marin's translation had rendered, at Urin's request, in terms so clear that there was no comfortable ambiguity remaining. The council deliberated for 3 hours and returned a finding. The expansion pact's territorial provisions were unratified under the 7th clause of the founding document and therefore not in legal effect. The Wallow Plain clan territories remained clan territories. The construction already completed could remain. The council was practical about sunk costs, but all further construction on clan holdings required elder ratification. The soldiers who had operated without sanction in the unnamed settlements were to be identified, and their commanders held accountable. The accountability provision was, Racketti's knew, the part that would move slowly. Accountability always moved slowly. But it was in the document now, which meant it was real in the way that written things are real, imperfect, and subject to interpretation, but present, unable to be burned. Dorvith did not attend the proceeding and did not contest the finding. He was, Racketti suspected, a pragmatic orc who had tested the leverage points and found them sound on the other side, and who was capable of updating when the logic required it. He did not, over the following months, make peace with the Elders' Council in any warm sense of the word, but he did not violate it either, which was, for now, enough. It was Marin who came to Racketti's in the evening after the proceeding, when the colonnade had emptied, and the fires were low, and the ruins were settling back into their usual quiet. She sat down cross-legged on the floor in the way she always did, knees together, elbows on knees, the posture of someone who has decided to be somewhere and intends to stay. "You did it," she said. "The seventh clause did it," Racketti said, "and Urin and the elders." "You found the seventh clause." "Urin found the seventh clause. I just asked the right question." Marin looked at her with those dark, dry eyes. "That's the same thing," she said. Racketti's thought about that, about the tactical philosophy text and its argument about leverage, about small pressures applied at the right point, about the way she'd arrived in the Eastern Territories furious and alone, and about the community that had assembled itself in the ruins around a principle she hadn't fully articulated even to herself until Marin had named it. How to not be erased. "Your settlement," Racketti said. "The school. What would you want to do if we were going to rebuild it?" Marin was quiet for a moment. In the fire's light, the ash was long since washed from her hands and face, replaced by ink stains from the inscription work. She looked not like a survivor anymore, not only like a survivor, but like someone who had passed through surviving and come out on the other side into something else. Into the territory that followed grief and found it was not empty, but was instead the ground on which things could be built. "I'd want it bigger," Marin said. "Not a settlement school, a proper school, the kind where people come to it from different places." She looked around at the colonnade, at the maps and documents and decoded inscriptions. "The kind like this." Racketti's looked around too, at the room they'd built in the ruins of someone else's civilization, out of the people that two different expansions had discarded, at the books and the accumulated knowledge and the methodology of understanding how things work and why, of asking questions until you find the one that opens the door. "Then it will be bigger," she said. "They'll try again," Marin said. "The syndicate." "Someone like the syndicate, it won't stop." "No," Racketti said, "it won't. So the school has to keep teaching." "Yes. Even after we're gone." Racketti's looked at her. At 9 years old and all the ash she'd walked through to get here, and all the things she'd read and remembered and refused to let burn. "Especially after we're gone," she said. They sat in the colonnade as the fires went low, and the ruins around them settled into the particular quiet of old stones that have held many things and know they will hold more. And somewhere in the Eastern Territories, the stars came out over the plateau and the Gallo wastes, and the distant lights of the Wallow Plains where the clans were still, against everything, holding what was theirs. Gret appeared eventually, as he always did, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a patient stone wall who had a destination and knew it. "The Wallow elders want a meeting tomorrow," he said, "about the school." "Tell them first light," Racketti said. He nodded and left. Marin was already taking notes. This was the thing about humans. which Raketes had been observing for almost a year, and which she had not yet fully assembled into language, but which sat in her chest like something that had taken root. They read the books in burning buildings, and they remembered what they'd read, and they sat in the ruins of everything they'd lost and asked questions about the inscriptions on the walls until someone gave them a notebook, and then they started writing. They carried their dead with them, but not as chains, as names, as evidence, as the accurate testimony of things that happened that must not be lied about and must not be forgotten. They were stubborn in the way that water is stubborn, not because they couldn't be moved, but because they found every crack and stayed. Raketes had been trained by the Horde in the philosophy of force, and she had spent 6 months learning a different philosophy from the ruins, and from the people who had come to them, and from the child who had arrived in ash and stayed in ink. And what she understood now, sitting in the colonnade while the fires went low, and Marin took notes on the structure of tomorrow's meeting, and the stars came out over the Gallo wastes, was that the difference between the two philosophies was exactly the difference between endurance and purpose, between survival and building, between the slow death with better posture, and the thing that came after it that the founding documents authors had been reaching toward when they wrote the 7th clause and the 2nd clause, and all the other clauses that added up to a living argument about what a community owed its smallest members. You do not erase anyone. That was the rule. That was the school's founding document, unwritten but known, and Raketes had not written it either. It had been taught to her in the ruins by the people who had found her there, by the humans and Farron and Orcs and Solhari who had assembled around the principle as naturally as water assembles around the lowest point, because it was true, and they had all been living inside its opposite and could recognize the difference. Tomorrow there would be a meeting about the school, and the day after that, and the day after that. And eventually, not quickly, because nothing that lasted had ever gone quickly, the ruins would be something else, not rebuilt into what they'd been, which was gone and should stay gone, the civilization that had built the columns with the worn inscriptions having worked out its time on the plateau and passed, but rebuilt into what they were becoming, a place where the erased came and learned the names of what had happened to them, and learned to ask the questions that opened doors and carried it forward. Raketes, 4th daughter of Clan Ketes, former warrior of the Vargathos Horde, leaned her back against the old stone and looked at Marin's bent head, and heard in the settling of the ruins something that sounded, if she was honest with herself, like purpose. She had not found it where she'd expected to. She had found it where it was. She had not found it where she'd expected to. She had found it where it was. Porig came to her, the night before the elders' meeting, and handed her the flask without ceremony. She took it and drank and handed it back, and he sat down on the colonnade steps with the comfortable weight of someone who had been in a great many places and had decided this was worth staying in. "You're going to be asked to lead it," Porig said, "the school formally. Not just the way you've been leading it, which is the way you lead everything, from the middle instead of the front. They're going to want a name and a seat and a title." "I know," Raketes said. "You going to take it?" She thought about it in the way she always thought about hard things, without rushing the answer, letting it arrive at its own pace. "I'm going to take the responsibility," she said. "The title they can keep. Titles are for people who need the word to know what they are." Porig made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained one. "Your mother used to say something like that." "My mother said a lot of things. She wasn't wrong about most of them." Raketes looked at him. Porig had been with her from the beginning, from before the beginning really, from the time when she was still a Horde warrior who asked inconvenient questions at council meetings, and he had never once asked her where they were going or whether they'd thought it through. He had just come, steady as stone, and kept the fire. "Why did you stay?" she said. "When I packed the billet, you didn't have to come." "No," he said. "So why?" He stoppered the flask and put it back in his pack with the careful precision she recognized as his form of sentiment, the way he treated things of value. "Because you were right. he said simply. And someone had to stay with right until it was big enough to take care of itself. She sat with that for a while. Outside, the Eastern Territories went on in their patient way, and the fire burned, and the stars over the Gallo wastes were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent and steady. It's big enough now, she said. Almost, Porig said. Give it another year. Outside, the fire Porig kept going. He always kept it going. It was one of his reliable qualities, reflected off the columns, and made the worn inscriptions look briefly readable, the old language swimming up toward legibility for just a moment before settling back into mystery. Marin would figure it out. She would figure it out because she had read everything about pre-compact Solhari linguistics, and because she asked good questions, and because the things you carried in your head were the things that no one could burn, and she had carried so much and burned nothing. Racketti's closed the tactical philosophy text and put it in her pack. She picked up the founding document. She turned to the 7th clause. She read it again, slowly in the firelight, the way you read something you are going to need to teach.